Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're digging into, well, frankly, an incredible stack of sources you've brought together. We've got radical political theology, Spinozist rationalism, some heavy-hitting 20th century phenomenology,
Right.
all focused on what has to be one of the most audacious philosophical moves in religious history.
It really is. We're talking about Paul's audacity.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, the Apostle Paul's decision to, well, fundamentally rewrite the core moral teaching of the early Messianic movement. It's huge.
Okay, let's unpack this because it sounds almost unbelievable. We all know the dual command, right?
Yeah.
Jesus brings together the entire law, boils it down to two things. Love God first, absolutely, and then love your neighbor as yourself.
The absolute foundation. Yeah.
Exactly, it's central. But Paul, writing possibly even before the Gospels we have were finalized, he does something massive. He performs this huge theological subtraction.
Uh-huh.
He cuts it down to only love your neighbor.
And that omission, it's just not an oversight. You can't read it that way. It's a deliberate, I'd say, revolutionary theological and philosophical statement. And it's echoed down through, well, 2 millennia.
The command to love God, the transcendent part, the absolute core, he just drops it.
Gone. In our mission today, our deep dive is really to understand the why behind that. Why did Paul zero in only on the immediate, the tangible, the worldliness of loving the neighbor?
So we're going to look at this through, what, 4 key thinkers: Jacob Tabbs, Baruch Spinoza, Martin Heidegger, and Giorgio Agamben, trying to understand what Paul really meant by embracing worldliness.
Exactly. Was this reduction like a political statement, a kind of philosophical necessity? Or maybe it's the key to understanding a truly radical way of messianic living.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then, with the original command.
Right. To really feel the weight of what Paul did, you have to grasp just how central, how authoritative that original dual command was. I mean, Jesus is asked point blank, which commandment is the greatest?
And he doesn't invent something new.
No. He connects 2 incredibly ancient, revered laws from the Torah. He synthesizes them.
The first one, the big one, what Christians call the Great Commandment. That's the bedrock of monotheism, right? It's from the Shema, Deuteronomy 6.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord.
And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart and with all thy soul and with all thy might. It's about absolute love for God, total commitment, heart, soul, everything.
And then he links that absolute sort of vertical commitment.
To the horizontal one.
Exactly. The commitment to other people, drawn straight from Leviticus 19. You must love your neighbor as yourself.
But the key thing you're saying is the hierarchy.
Absolutely crucial. In Matthew 22 and Mark 12, the Gospels, they are crystal clear. Love God is the first and greatest commandment. That priority is explicitly stated. It sets the whole structure.
And Luke confirms this too, doesn't he? Luke 10, the story with the lawyer who asks Jesus about eternal life.
That's right. And it's the lawyer himself who quotes the combined dual commandment. He puts them together.
And Jesus says,
Jesus affirms it. You have given the right answer. Do this and you will live. So, I mean, this wasn't some minor point. It was the absolute non-negotiable core teaching for the earliest followers.
okay, so the foundation is rock solid. Love God first, then neighbor.
And this is where Paul comes in. And honestly, the ground just shifts beneath your feet. In Galatians 5, he writes quite starkly, for the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command, love your neighbor as yourself.
Just the one. He doesn't say love God and neighbor.
No, he says the entire law, everything, fulfilled in the neighbor command.
Wow. And he doubles down on this, right, in Romans.
He does. He repeats it, cementing the subtraction. Romans 13. Whatever other commands there may be, they're summed up in this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. Same reduction.
So, okay, let me get this straight. He doesn't just reduce 2 commands to 1.
No.
He reduces it to the second one, the lesser of the 2, according to the Gospel's hierarchy.
Precisely. He ditches the transcendent requirement, the first and greatest, and focuses entirely on the practical, the immediate, the worldly embodied relationship right here with the neighbor.
That wasn't just editing. That feels like rewriting the operating system.
It was an act of profound intellectual audacity.
Oh.
It's just stunning when you sit with it.
It seems so counterintuitive, though.
Right.
Why sideline the ultimate source, the love of God part? This is clearly what fascinated thinkers for centuries.
Right.
So if Paul knew this dual command was central, why? Why perform what you called this absolutely revolutionary act?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. Let's turn to our first interpreter, a 20th century thinker who saw Paul's move as basically, well, as weaponized theology. Okay, Jacob Tabbs. mid-20th century. A fascinating, intense figure. He reads Paul as deeply anti-institutional, a real revolutionary spirit.
And for Taubes, this reduction isn't about finding a simpler summary.
Not at all. Taubes frames it as deliberate, even hostile. He actually called the text highly polemical against Jesus. He saw it as a direct attack on the whole structure of the dual command in the law, the nomos itself.
Polemical against Jesus, that's strong stuff. But how does that connect to, politics, the state? That seems like a bit of a leap.
Well, for Taubes, there's really no daylight between theology and politics. They're inseparable. He argued Paul was issuing nothing less than a political declaration of war on the Caesar.
Okay, hang on. How does dropping the love God command declare war on Caesar?
We need to think about the Roman imperial cult. What did Rome demand? It demanded pistis.
Pistis, faith, loyalty.
Fidelity, loyalty, faith. Exactly. Faith in Caesar. The whole Roman state, its order, its law, nomos, was built on securing that pistis in the emperor.
Okay. So Taubes is arguing that Paul takes that very specific imperial language, pistis, and redirects it.
Precisely. He redirects it towards Christ, the one who was executed by Roman law, by nomos.
So declaring Christ as Lord isn't just a spiritual statement.
For Taubes, it's inherently political. It's revolutionary. Paul's message in this reading is that the true emperor, the true imperator, is the guy on the cross.
Wow. So Paul becomes a revolutionary nihilist. That's Taubes' phrase.
Yeah, revolutionary nihilist, scrambling out from under the whole mishmash, as Taubes put it, of Jewish, Greek, Roman law. Nihilist because he negates the existing power structure, the existing nomos. Revolutionary because he offers this completely different focus for faith, for pistis.
Okay, that helps explain the political charge Taubes sees, but I'm still circling back to the original question. Why drop the love God command specifically? How does this political war connect to, the Almighty?
That's where Taubes admits it gets tricky. And he connects Paul's move to what he sees as a strong Gnostic tendency in Paul's thinking.
Gnosticism. Okay, refresh me. Very basically.
Very basically, Gnosticism often posits this radical split between the material world, which is seen as flawed or even evil, and a true transcendent God who is utterly separate, far away. Often, the creator of the material world isn't the same as the ultimate good Father God.
Right, so if Paul has Gnostic leanings, then God the Father is remote, outside this messy world.
Thoroughly transmundane, yes.
Hmm?
And the material world, the cosmos, isn't God's good creation. It's fundamentally flawed. In this view, God's ray of love struggles to even reach us. It's interrupted by all these powers of earthly and heavenly providence.
So the world is just good for saving, as Taubes puts it,
Yeah.
not inherently valuable.
Exactly. And if the world itself is suspect, maybe even the work of a lesser creator God, then Taubes suggests Paul might have been ambivalent about that creator God, the one who gave the law in the first place.
If you're ambivalent about the creator, the source of the law.
Then the command to love that specific creator, the first command, becomes, well, sidelineable, less urgent, maybe even problematic.
Taubes even pushes this further, suggesting Paul was on the way to Marcion. Marcion was the guy who really drove that wedge between the Old Testament God and the Father of Jesus.
He did. The infamous Gnostic who made them two completely different beings. Taubes implies Paul was heading in that direction, that maybe the references to the Father in Paul feel like an addendum, and Christ's saving act is really the whole story.
Okay, so there's a Gnostic suspicion of the creator God, and this links to Paul's view of the world itself.
Yes, Taubes argues this negative view of the world, this cosmos, is reinforced by Paul's intense expectation of the parousia of the second coming. It's happening any day now.
Right, the end times are imminent.
So if the world's about to end, Taubes argues, following scholars like Bultmann and Bornkamp, Paul sees little value in worldliness. The cosmos for Paul often has that pejorative sense. As Bultmann said, it's the realm of Satan, full of hostile powers you need saving from.
And this all leads back to that tricky passage in 1 Corinthians 7, the Hosmi passage.
Exactly, 1 Corinthians 7:29-32, where Paul says things like, "Those who have wives should live as though they had none, those who mourn as if they did not."
Which Taubes reads how?
He reads it as Paul's ultimate, apocalyptic, eschatological profession of faith. Basically, the final advice of this revolutionary nihilist. Meaning, if the world is fundamentally corrupt, a kind of swindle, and it's all going to vanish tomorrow anyway,
Yeah.
why bother? Why engage in political revolution? Why get deeply entangled in worldly affairs? Just pay your taxes, show outward obedience to the powers that be, and wait. Keep your head down until the end.
So Taubes Paul is this really strange paradox. He's a revolutionary declaring war on Caesar and the law,
Yes.
who drops the love God command partly out of a Gnostic suspicion of the creator, only to end up advocating a kind of quietism, a withdrawal from the world because the apocalypse is nigh.
It's a very dramatic reading, isn't it?
Hmm.
Compelling in its intensity, but definitely conflicted. Paul reduces the command in this view, not because he values the neighbor more, but because he fundamentally values the world and maybe even its creator less.
It's an evacuation of the transcendent, leaving only the neighbor relationship as a kind of temporary holding pattern until the real show starts.
That's the Taub's interpretation,
Mm.
in essence. A powerful, political, but ultimately world-negating Paul.
Okay, let's shift gears dramatically. We're jumping back centuries now to the 17th century. Baruch Spinoza in Amsterdam.
A complete change of scene. Spinoza, the arch-rationalist.
And incredibly, he also picks up on Paul's reduction. He sees it as critically important in his own major work, the Theological Political Treatise.
He absolutely does. But Spinoza's whole project is different from Taub's. Spinoza wants to establish the supremacy of universal reason over, the dictates of specific religious authorities or particular revealed texts.
He wants philosophy reason to be the ultimate guide.
Exactly. And for that project, Spinoza kind of needed Paul.
Yeah.
He believed, or at least argued, that the apostles' letters, especially Paul's, were written using the natural light of reason alone.
So he could frame Paul not as a mystic, but as a fellow rationalist.
Pretty much. It allowed Spinoza to present Paul as a powerful ally and advocate for reason, which was absolutely essential for Spinoza's goal of building a tolerant, philosophically grounded state.
And Paul's reduction, just focusing on loving the neighbor, fits perfectly into that rationalist agenda, doesn't it?
Perfectly. Because loving your neighbor, that's something Spinoza believes everyone can grasp through reason. It's universally understandable, rationally justifiable across different cultures, different beliefs. You don't need special revelation to see why it's good.
Right. But the love God command, that's trickier for a rationalist like Spinoza.
Much trickier. Because it seems to depend on the arbitrary will of a divine being. Like a king issuing an order, you must love me. And Spinoza's entire philosophy pushes back hard against thinking of God as some kind of cosmic prince issuing decrees.
So how does Spinoza handle it? How does he rationalize away the first and greatest commandment?
He makes this really crucial philosophical distinction. He argues that the command to love God isn't actually a command in the normal sense at all.
It's not an order.
No. Spinoza calls it a divine natural law. It's more like a virtue. It's a state of being that is necessarily present in someone who correctly knows and understands God through reason. It's not something you obey. It's something you are if you understand reality properly.
Okay, that distinction is subtle, but feels really important. Obedience versus virtue.
It's huge. If you follow an order just because someone told you to, that's obedience. It depends entirely on the will, the authority of the commander. But if you act out of an inner compulsion, a kind of necessity that comes from your own understanding, that's virtue.
Like knowing stealing is wrong versus just not stealing because you fear getting caught.
Exactly. Spinoza uses a great analogy. Someone who only gives people what they're owed because they're scared of the gallows or maybe scared of divine punishment later on, that person isn't truly just.
True justice comes from conviction.
From a fixed conviction of the mind and understanding, as Spinoza puts it, not from fear, not from just following the external will of some authority figure, whether human or divine. True love, true justice, flows from rational understanding.
So, for Spinoza's Paul, once you understand the reason behind a divine law, and for Spinoza, that ultimate reason is always reason itself, then it stops being an arbitrary command.
Precisely. It transforms. It becomes an eternal truth. Divine commandments only look like decrees when we're ignorant of their cause, their rational basis. Once we grasp the cause, they're not orders anymore. They're just true statements about how reality works.
Okay, so Paul's famous critique of the law, for Spinoza, is actually Paul realizing that the only thing that truly commands us is our own reason.
That's Spinoza's reading. Reason itself shows us why we need to act for the common good, why we need mutual support and care, which is love of neighbor.
And the command to love God, the transcendent part.
It kind of dissipates. It dissolves into the imminent requirement to love your neighbor simply by the light of reason. The idea of a transcendent God commanding love relies on that old model of God as an external ruler, which Spinoza rejects.
So it sounds like Spinoza is saying Paul made the reduction because the higher command, love God, was fundamentally miscategorized.
Yeah.
It never should have been seen as a command, only as a description of a state of rational understanding.
That's basically the argument. Mystical or commanded love of God finds its complete and total fulfillment in the rational love of neighbor. And reason itself demands that love of neighbor, whether God commanded it or not.
Even faith, pistis gets rationalized.
Yeah, for Spinoza's Paul, pescis means nothing other than full mental assent to these rational truths. It's about intellectual conviction. We can know God through reason, and therefore love God as a consequence of that knowledge, but we can't obey God in the sense of following arbitrary decrees, because a truly rational God wouldn't issue them.
So Paul becomes this champion of radical human rationality. He strips away the need for the supernatural command love, the transcendent authority figure, to focus entirely on the one ethical rule that reason itself can discover and validate everywhere.
Mutual, rational, reciprocal love of your neighbor.
Yeah. Spinoza basically uses Paul's bold textual move to anchor his own philosophical project. The highest human virtue isn't found in obeying some sky god, but in this rational, in-the-world relationship with others.
The value is inherent. It's immanent right here.
Yeah.
It doesn't need any transcendent scaffolding to prop it up or enforce it. It stands on its own, rationally.
Okay, we've had Paul the political polemicist from Taubes and Paul the rational universalist from Spinoza. Now we're shifting again, quite dramatically, to the 20th century, but this time to phenomenology.
Right, Martin Heidegger and
Oh.
later Giorgio Agamben. And they look at Paul's reduction very differently. For them, it's not primarily about political attack or philosophical reason. It's about something more existential. It's about defining the very nature of messianic life itself.
Messianic life, meaning how someone lives in this world while waiting for or participating in the messianic age.
Exactly. How do you exist now in the time between times? And to understand this, we have to dive deep into another crucial Pauline text, maybe the crucial text for this discussion.
Which one is that?
1 Corinthians 7, verses 29 to 32. It's often seen as Paul's most direct, most rigorous definition of how the believer should relate to the world, to worldliness, while expecting the end. And the absolute P is a tiny two-word Greek phrase, hosme.
Hosme. Okay, let's look at the passage again. This is what I mean, brothers and sisters. The time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not hosme, those who mourn as if they did not hosme, those who buy something as if it were not hosme theirs to keep.
Right, now the traditional translation, the one most people know, is as if not.
Yeah, live married but as if you weren't. Mourn but as if you weren't really mourning. Buy but as if you didn't really own it.
And that reading suggests a kind of detachment. Like you go through the motions of worldly life, but inwardly, spiritually, you're withdrawn. You're disengaged from those relationships and possessions.
Sort of mental reservation, otherworldliness while still being here.
Exactly. But Heidegger and Agamben, building on him, they fundamentally reject that as if not translation. They insist it should be translated simply as not.
Just as not. How does removing the if make such a big difference? Why is that translation so crucial for them?
Well, for Heidegger, that little word if, as if, implies an objective comparison. It sets up a kind of dualism, as if the Christian is meant to mentally jump out of their worldly condition and compare it to some other state, maybe a future redeemed state. It suggests eliminating ties to the world, aiming for otherworldliness.
And Heidegger says Paul wasn't thinking like that.
Heidegger insists Paul knew nothing of that later metaphysical split between this flawed world of appearance and some true world elsewhere. Paul was thinking more immediately, existentially.
Okay, so if it's as not, married as not married, what does that actually mean? You're not pretending. You are married, but somehow not.
It's a massive shift. Heidegger reads this within the context of what he calls compressed temporality. Remember, Paul says the time is short. For Heidegger, this means there's no time left for postponement, no time for waiting around. The parousia, the messianic arrival or return, isn't something you passively wait for. It has to be lived and acted right now.
You have to embody the end time now.
In a way, yes. And that means messianic life can't be about stepping out of the world. It has to be about seizing the world's conditions, your actual life circumstances, in a new way.
Agamben takes this even further, right? He really clarifies the as not.
He does. Agamben argues the hosme isn't pointing towards some other, better redeemed world beyond this one. Instead, it pushes the worldly activity back onto itself. But it does something crucial. It revokes its factical condition.
Okay, factical condition. Unpack that for us. What does that mean here?
Think of the factical condition as the sort of standard social, legal, or institutional weight and meaning of a situation. So the factical condition of being married includes the legal contract, the social expectations, the property rights, all that stuff. The factical condition of mourning is the public performance of grief, the expected rituals. Ownership is the legal title.
Right, the standard way these things function in the world.
Exactly. So when Paul says weeping is not weeping, Agamben reads this as revoking the institutional necessity or the social obligation tied to the act of weeping. You're still weeping, the tears are real, but that weeping is somehow freed from the external law or expectation of mourning. It's decoupled from its standard facticity.
The action itself is still happening, but its connection to the normal rules, the nomos, is broken. It's rendered inoperative. Is that the term Agamben uses?
That's a key term for Agamben. Inoperative. The standard function is deactivated. But crucially, the thing itself, the marriage, the grief, the possession, isn't destroyed or negated entirely. It's just suspended from its normal operation.
So it's not about being otherworldly at all. It sounds like an incredibly intense this worldliness.
That's the paradox. The factical conditions, marriage, mourning, buying, they appear in this kind of negated form, suspended. And that suspension, paradoxically, makes them available for a completely new kind of relationship, a new form of use.
And this relates to Paul's summary phrase at the end of that passage about the form of the world passing away.
Yes, 1 Corinthians 7.31. Traditionally, the present form schema of this world is passing away. Agamben really focuses on that word schema. He translates it more like the figure or the way of being or even the fashion of this world.
So it's not the substance of the world that's disappearing?
No, it's the figure, the way the world is currently organized, configured, the way it operates institutionally, that's what's passing away. Its current schema is dissolving.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see it. The hosme, the as-not, is the mechanism that allows you to live within those dissolving forms.
Exactly. The hosme creates what Agamben calls a zone of indistinction between this world and the world to come. It's not about escaping to the next world. It's about living in the dissolving figure of this one.
And this connects back to God if the world's figure is passing.
Well, in this messianic lens, particularly as Agamben reads it, the world is revealed as fundamentally abandoned by the old frameworks, including maybe even the direct governance of the transcendent God. God is present perhaps only in the form of absence.
That sounds bleak.
But here's the twist. This abandoned world, precisely because it can't be simply transcended or saved in the old way, because its figure is passing. It becomes the highest value. It's the only place left to live. The figure is passing, Agamben says, but the world itself remains, open now for a different kind of dwelling, a different kind of use.
Wow, okay. This completely reframes Paul's reduction then. He drops the love God command.
Because the world, the immediate, factical, neighbor-filled world, lived under the sign of hosme, is the only place where this messianic transformation of life, this new way of dwelling, can actually happen. The focus has to be here on the neighbor. So both Heidegger and Agamben land on this idea of a radical, non-transcendent worldliness as key to Paul's thought, but they diverge in a really subtle but important way. It's about how the messianic person relates to this worldliness that's been opened up by the hosme.
Okay. And the difference hinges on these two words, appropriation versus use.
Exactly. Let's start with Heidegger's earlier reading, focusing on appropriation. The German is Zugeignet. What does Heidegger mean by the Christian appropriating their worldliness?
Appropriating, like seizing it, taking ownership of it.
Sort of. Heidegger saw Paul's messianic life as actively seizing the conditions of the world you find yourself in. Remember, the call is to a transformation of life. The Greek word is peripatine, literally walking around or conducting oneself in life. It's not about escaping life's conditions.
And because the time is short, that compressed temporality.
Right. The parousia is felt as imminent, demanding immediate enactment now. There's no waiting. So the Christian must actively grasp, seize, take possession of their worldly situation, their marriage, their job, their social status, and live it differently.
That sounds incredibly intense, almost violent, seizing your condition because the end is now.
It's definitely intense, and Heidegger argued that this very act of grasping, of appropriation under pressure, creates an enlarged tension, creates anguish. The Messianic Christian, for Heidegger, fundamentally suffers.
The suffering is the proof.
In a way, yes. The anguish generated by facing the immediate end, the certainty of it, and the abandonment of the old transcendent structures. That tension is the proof of the calling. It's a burden.
So for Heidegger's Paul, you appropriate love of neighbor because you've seized the stark realization that love only exists, only happens in the actual act of loving this neighbor right here, right now, under this immense pressure.
Exactly. But that love is shot through with the anguish of existence under the sign of hosme, lived in that compressed time.
Okay, so that's appropriation. How does Agamben differ with his concept of use, uso in Italian?
Agamben, while deeply influenced by Heidegger, critiques this idea of appropriation. He thinks appropriation still sounds too much like there's a subject, a self, standing slightly outside the world, reaching in to seize its condition.
It still implies a distance, a subject acting on the world.
Yeah. And for Agamben, that's not quite radical enough. It's not full being in the world, to use a Heideggerian phrase against him, perhaps.
So if the messianic subject isn't appropriating, what defines it instead?
Its use. For Agamben, the key to messianic subjectivity is that it has no propriety whatsoever. Nothing is proper to the subject. The subject doesn't own or possess its worldliness in order to appropriate it. Why? Because the subject is nothing other than its worldliness. It's a life that is generated only in the act of living it. It's what Agamben calls a form of life.
Whoa. Okay, that's a subtle but pretty massive ontological shift. If I appropriate my marriage like in Heidegger, I'm seizing its meaning under pressure. But if I use my marriage, in Agamben's sense,
Then your very being is the way you live that marriage as not. The subjectivity emerges from the use, it doesn't precede it and then seize it.
my existence is the practice.
Precisely. And the hosme, the as not, is the technical device that makes this use possible. Remember how it rendered the old forms marriage, commerce, legal status inoperative. It deactivated their standard institutional
We
function,
suspended them.
but didn't destroy them. By rendering them inoperative as binding laws or institutions, the hosme makes them available to be used in a new way. They become habitable again, but differently. The new creature Paul talks about isn't some magically transformed being. It's simply this intense messianic use of the old forms, now emptied of their obligatory power.
You live in the forms, but you're not bound by their old logic. You inhabit them freely.
Exactly. They become pure potential for living.
Okay. Bring this back, finally, to Paul's reduction of the dual commandment. How does Agamben explain that reduction using this idea of use?
This is where it clicks. For Agamben, the command to love God is deactivated. It's rendered inoperative by the messianic reality, by the hosme logic. But, and this is crucial, it's not replaced or simply ignored.
It's not just deleted.
No. Instead, the love God command is now entirely inhabited by the love of my neighbor. The form of loving God is made available for use, and its content, its practice, becomes loving the neighbor. The love refers to nothing higher than the neighbor themselves, right here.
So there's no hierarchy anymore because the higher command hasn't vanished. It's just fulfilled. Its entire operational reality is now found within the mundane act of loving the person next to you.
Perfectly put. The transcendent command is fulfilled by being reduced to a state of use in the immanent worldly act.
That is quite something. The love God command isn't ignored or demoted. It's made fully operational only through loving the neighbor. Reducing it to the lesser command is actually the ultimate way of enacting it, of making it real in this messianic time.
It elevates the way of being in the world to the absolute center. And this really highlights that emotional or existential difference between Heidegger and Agamben we touched on.
How so?
Heidegger's hosme, with its focus on appropriation under pressure, it tends to increase suffering, the anguish of facing abandonment in compressed time.
Right, the burden.
But Agamben's hosme, focused on use and inhabiting forms, seems to intensify living. It emphasizes the potential, the capacity to dwell, to use, to make the world habitable now. It feels much closer, actually, to Spinoza's idea that wisdom is a meditation on life, not on death.
So Paul's reduction in this final reading isn't about nihilism or even just rationality. It's the ultimate argument for finding value, meaning, and even the divine right here in the act of living fully within the world's passing forms.
Dwelling in the present, using what's given, loving the neighbor right in front of you. That becomes the whole practice. Hashtag OTRO, host, speaker, and expert speaker.
Wow, okay. What an incredible journey through interpretations of this one single audacious Pauline move, taking that foundational dual commandment and just reducing it. It really forced generations of thinkers to grapple with what Christian action, what messianic life truly means in the world.
It really did. We went from Jacob Taubes seeing it as this fierce political polemic, a declaration of war on Caesar, and the whole system of nomos.
Through Spinoza, finding in it a powerful confirmation of universal reason, fulfilling the love of God through rational love of neighbor.
And then landing with Heidegger and Agamben, who dives into the existential core. Using the hosme to argue it defines a radical way of being in the world, appropriating or, perhaps more powerfully, using worldliness itself.
And despite the very different angles, that final thread, especially coming out of Heidegger and Agamben's reading of hosme, seems to converge on a powerful idea.
Which is?
That Paul reduces love of God to love of neighbor because for the believer living in this messianic tension, worldliness, the immediate, the tangible, the neighbor isn't secondary. It's the only place where life is lived, where transformation happens, where value resides.
Yeah, transcendent reference point is either, polemically dismissed by Taubes or rationally absorbed by Spinoza or existentially deactivated and turned into use by Gambin. But the result is the same. The neighbor is right here. The action is required now.
Paul's move really forces us to think about where we place value. Does our ability to love this messy, mundane, factical world, the person right next to us, does that need a higher justification? Does it need that transcendent command hanging over it?
Or, and this is maybe the radical challenge from Paul via Gambin, is the very capacity to put our lives, our jobs, our relationships to use, to live them in that intense, liberated form of the as not, is that highest expression of faith,
Yeah.
of freedom, of maybe even love of God itself.
It shifts everything.
So here's a final thought to leave you with, maybe something to mull over. If love of God is truly and entirely fulfilled in the seemingly mundane act of loving your neighbor,
Sure.
what happens if you try to live your own life, even just for a moment, under that sign of Hasmi?
Living it as not.
Yeah. Married is not married. Owning is not owning. Grieving is not grieving. If you could genuinely liberate some part of your everyday transient life from its usual institutional weight, its need for external justification, what part of that everyday existence, precisely because it's been set free, because it's just used, what part suddenly becomes its highest, most potent, maybe even its most divine value?